What is the most creepy cult you know about? Story 1. The Ant Hill Kids. For years, provincial authorities suspected something was seriously wrong inside Terrio's cult because the members lived in such shockingly primitive and unhealthy conditions. But since the commune was legally registered as a church, officials were restricted in what they could do. They weren't allowed to investigate the adults at all. They were only permitted to intervene for the children's safety. Excuse me? What? So churches in Ontario used to be shielded from investigation? Please tell me this law has changed because that's horrifying. Story 2. Scientology. A relative of mine gave them the equivalent of $1 million over about a decade. It ruined him. He lost his house, his family, and eventually his ability to function. He'd inherited a successful business from his father or grandfather, and little by little he'd liquidated everything to funnel the money into Scientology. By the time it was over, he was homeless, addicted to drugs, and completely cut off from his loved ones. And because he donated everything voluntarily, there was absolutely no legal recourse. They destroyed his life, and he couldn't do anything about it. Story 3. Aum Shinrikyo still creeps me out because of how calculated and capable they were. They specifically recruited scientists, engineers, and highly educated professionals, people in influential roles. Once inside, members were drugged, manipulated, and convinced they needed to help trigger a world-ending war. They stockpiled weapons, even managed to acquire a helicopter, and eventually carried out the Tokyo subway sarin attack. What's terrifying is knowing that if they had been more organized or patient, they had the resources and knowledge to inflict far more damage. Story 4. It's hard to pick which cult was the worst. Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate, Aum Shinrikyo, the Branch Davidians. Most were some blend of religion and the leaders made up doctrine, with extreme control over their members. People tend to say all churches are cults, but that really dilutes what actual dangerous cults are. I completely agree. As a cult survivor, it makes me angry when people lump normal religious communities in with real cults. That comparison falls apart instantly once you've experienced the difference. A genuine cult uses manipulation, isolation, and psychological control, whereas a small local church or synagogue is just a community gathering around shared beliefs. Not all cults are religious either. Mao's personality cult during China's Cultural Revolution is a perfect example of a non-religious one that was still incredibly destructive. Story 5. Aum Shinrikyo, again responsible for Japan's worst terrorist attack. They used sarin, a deadly invisible nerve agent, in crowded subway lines. They basically created pure, invisible death and unleashed it on one of the busiest populations in the world. They also bought weapons from Russia and had quiet influence over parts of the Japanese government. They're terrifying because in the 80s and 90s, they were essentially real-life Japanese Illuminati operating in the shadows. Bonus eerie detail. It's rumored that former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's assassination was connected to Japanese cults, not Aum Shinrikyo, but others. Japan has a bigger cult problem than most people realize. Story 6. The Hare Krishnas don't get even a fraction of the criticism they deserve, and I say that because I was born into it. I was insulated from some of the worst parts, but if you grow up in one of their communes, that's your entire world and none of it feels real or healthy. Despite all their preaching about purity and self-control, both the boys and girls were constantly hooking up. The hypocrisy was everywhere. It's a servitude-based cult built on the idea that you're inherently flawed and must devote yourself to their system. They lure people in with upbeat chanting, Indian aesthetics, and admittedly great food. Though ironically, the more authentic they've tried to become, the worse the food got. The old Western cooks made it better. Now they use yoga and wellness branding to quietly recruit. And if you're a woman in that faith, you're basically doomed. Story 7. The 12 Tribes is another dangerous one. They target people at jam band festivals, hikers on the Appalachian Trail, and anyone who looks vulnerable or exhausted. They show up with this friendly community vibe, offering tea, cookies, and a warm smile. If you go with them, they strip you of your possessions, put you to work on their farm or in one of their stores, force marriages, and push you to have children. Once you're in, they make it extremely hard to leave. Where I live, they even have a farm. One day, a woman collapsed near my house, painfully thin, severely dehydrated and confused. She said she'd just been out running, claimed she'd moved to town and didn't own a phone. She refused Gatorade and only wanted water. My wife and I drove her back to the farm. Turns out she had overdosed at a widespread panic show. The 12 tribes revived her on their infamous bus, and she felt so safe that she joined them. They sell incredible bread, though, and a surprising number of locals openly admit, yeah, they're a cult, but man, that bread is good. Story 8. Hair is a less obvious cult growing fast. Microsoft's internal culture. Their employee expectations are bizarrely cult-like. There's this obsessive devotion to forcing AI into every product, even when it makes things worse. Windows 11 breaks in random ways because of AI-generated code, and debugging is a nightmare. You can't ask a programmer what went wrong, because the programmer is now an AI model that lies and hallucinates solutions. You're expected to sacrifice everything for the good of the whole company. If you struggle, you are the problem. You must devote yourself entirely to the machine. If you can't give $100, then you're not worthy. The leadership is unhinged, pushing disproven productivity theories like infinite improvement. If you can't constantly get better forever, you're out. It's a really strange, cult-ish workplace. Story 9, I don't know if it's the worst cult out there, but it's my personal nightmare, The Kingdom of God, run by David E. Taylor. Along with the usual cult horrors like isolation, abuse, and sleep deprivation, they force members to work in their call center begging for money. Imagine working in a call center where you don't get paid because you're told that if you don't work, God will punish you. It's exploitation disguised as devotion. Story 10, Aum Shinrikyo, again a Japanese doomsday cult, turned full-blown terrorist organization after their sarin gas attacks in public spaces. Sarin is colorless, odorless, tasteless, basically invisible death, and they used it multiple times. The cult performed secret rituals involving shock therapy and hallucinogens, demanded members hand over all their money, and forced them to cut ties with family. In the 80s, a member tried to leave, and they literally murdered him for it. What's even worse is that the group didn't officially go defunct until 2022. The Japanese government claims the original organization no longer operates, but splinter groups are still being monitored. If you've ever played Yakuza 0, that Majima subplot with the cult, it's loosely based on Aum Shinrikyo, which is how a lot of people discover them today. Story 11, probably not exactly what you were asking for, but the Genestealer cults of the Warhammer 40k universe are definitely the most creepy and messed up cult. Glad they only exist as models in my shelf and as lore in books. Essentially, for the uninitiated, the Genestealer cults are the product of the hive mind of an alien species called the Tyranids, essentially a highly adaptable parasitical swarm, numbering high above trillions that consume the biomass of entire planetary systems, including the cities, their inhabitants, the forests, the wildlife, the bacteria, even the atmosphere, leaving a lifeless husk of a rock that once may have been a striving society. The Genestealer cults are the solution to a planet-sized problem. Why deal with billions of pesky human armies and their insane sci-fi tech when you can infiltrate every last speck of their society, kidnap people, infect them with Tyranid DNA, brainwash them into breeding human Tyranid hybrids that often enough look close enough to humans to not be too suspect, and then when the Tyranid hive fleets arrive, they disable, disrupt, and destroy the planet's defenses from the inside, only to be devoured in the end by the very entities they worshipped. Have fun with that rabbit hole. Story 12. A friend of mine accidentally got involved with a cult in Iowa. He thought it was just a really close-knit church, but eventually snapped that something wasn't right. He moved to Texas for work pretty shortly afterwards, and after about a week of being here, someone knocked on the door. It was one of the members. She came here, to try and talk him into going back, and progressively became more and more emotional. They ended up having to call the cops to have her removed from the property. Story 13, I worked for a cult. It was a private school for rich kids who had addictions. There was a dynamic leader who had an inner circle of young boys who he doted on. The school itself was somewhat abusive. Untrained staff like myself administering meds, and when I started, I was able to administer PRN Thorazine. As a staff member, I had to live like the students, adhere to the same rules and regs. Then they worked to distance me from my family, telling me I had an addiction, I didn't, and that it was dangerous for me to use my time off to see my family. I walked away after a few weeks because I thought I was too weak to work there. Then I went back and realized what a terrible place it was. Finally left, with a brand new eating disorder I had managed to avoid during my own adolescence. The school shut down eventually due to lawsuits from parents. The former students have a FB page, and from what I can tell, many struggle with the systematic abuse they experience. The leader has since died, and turned out all his degrees and awards were faked. It taught me a lot about safety and services for vulnerable people. The scariest moment was the student who was actively psychotic and should have been in a lockdown facility, but who was still with us. I was told to restrain him even though he wasn't fighting. He was on a hunger strike and refused to leave the building for a meeting. I had to carry him to the meeting, then restrain him the whole time. Story 14. My parents were members of a Islamic cult with a fake guru or holy man sort of thing. He used to lead group chants and things, and one time while everyone's eyes were closed, chanting away in the semi-darkness, me and him locked eyes and he realized that I was laughing at how dumb it was. He had a vendetta against me since then. He turned my parents against me first, convincing them that one day in the future, he could read the future, apparently roll his eyes, I would break their hearts and leave and destroy the family. Because they were so invested in him, they started believing it and treating me, a 13-year-old, as if I had already committed the unspeakable act. After this, he made my parents focus on my older brother more than me, lavishing him with expensive gifts such as Gucci watches, a brand new Mitsubishi Jeep with a private plate before he even passed his driving test, and experiences like executive box seats to major sports events up and down the country, plus more. This wasn't enough. After this, he convinced all of his followers that I was mentally handicapped and needed to be kept isolated. For most of my teenage years, I would come back from school or college or university to an empty house, many times not seeing another soul for weeks. The story of my parents' child spread through the entire community, where it is an accepted fact now, and I can't get married because everybody just assumes that I am mentally disabled. After this, he bankrupted my parents and family, making them pay all his bills and expenses and rewarding them with prayers. Story 15. I don't know if it was a cult or not, but I grew up in a church group that was pretty close, if not. My creepiest story is this. A big church that read controlled by fear. A lot of little churches ran a college, read unaccredited brainwashing for all the little church's kids, so we didn't have to go to secular school, which was pretty much considered the devil. The pastor of that big church was almost worshipped. Everyone loved him and gave him free rein to tell them what to do with their lives. I went to this college because there was really no other acceptable choice when my family was in this group. Between my freshman and sophomore year there, this pastor was convicted of having an affair with a teen girl he was counseling and of taking her across state lines, etc. He was later sentenced to 12 years in prison. The creepy factor is, I know for a fact that this man had keys to every door on campus, and he was known to make surprise visits to the girls' dormitories. Meaning, this convicted predator had a key to my room, and no one dared question him on anything. My family had been slowly on their way out for years, but this situation was the straw that broke. Story 16, very fundamental church, more extreme than most. I got my first clue at a women's gathering when we were passing out snacks, and a grown woman said to me, "Oh no, my husband doesn't allow me to eat potato chips." Allow? Interesting. I got more and more clues as I was there. People were upset with me for reading liberal magazines, which was Reader's Digest. Then I was shunned for using worldly means for trying to lose some weight and using a diet drink mix. I was told I should be praying about it and more faith. The kicker was when the pastor's wife told me that she could tell every day where I was in my walk with Jesus spiritually because of how much makeup I was wearing that day. Yup, time to go. Story 17. One day, the morning of going to said cult, my mother woke me up and tried to force dress me since I didn't feel like going. I had only gotten a few hours of sleep the night before, and I also felt slightly ill, like I had a cold, so I really wanted to stay home. After a few minutes of struggling to put ugly clothes on me, she gave up and slapped me approximately 7 times, tried to choke me, then shoved me off the bed onto the floor. She screamed at me that I would be in trouble for this rebellion and left for the cult meeting. That's when I finally decided I had enough and decided to leave it permanently. I had already been thinking about leaving, but this was just the final nail in the coffin. Later on, she got me a therapist for the purposes of trying to make me go to their cult meetings, crying that there was something wrong with her daughter. Lucky me, the therapist sided against her and told her to stop forcing me to go. Thankfully, she never did it again, though she lamented about me not believing anymore. This was about 7 years ago, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. In a way, it was sort of a good thing, because it opened my eyes to the world. Story 18. I was raised by Jehovah's Witnesses. They're certainly not a cult in the Jonestown sense of the word, but they're a lot more controlling than your typical church. They're obsessed with the idea that their faith is the one true religion. Members refer to the religion as the truth, and that the apocalypse is imminent. JWs basically live with an us against them view of the world, where they imagine that they're the only good people and the rest of the world are all ruled by the devil. They go preaching to try to save the few good people from this satanic world. I left simply because the doctrines didn't make sense to me, and I am not sure if any single event stands out as especially bizarre, but there's lots about their faith that's not quite normal. They have a pseudo-legal system that investigates and punishes members for breaking rules, like no affairs outside of marriage, no smoking, no blood transfusions, etc. They even have a rule that states you're not allowed to divorce and remarry unless your spouse dies or cheats on you. So, if a Jehovah's Witness married couple gets divorced, it's basically a standoff to see which one starts a new relationship first and gets shunned for it. Then the other one will be free to remarry. Story 19 went to a non-denominational church for a very short period of time that I believe was a cult. In the back of the church, there was a small hallway behind the altar. On one wall, there was a low bookshelf that was full of Benny Hinn videos. In the middle of the hallway, there was a smaller hallway that led up to 2 bathrooms on the left and a little room on the right, probably used for Bible study or whatever else. I was back there in that hallway one night and the bathroom door was open with the light off. It contained a light bulb that hung from the ceiling. I kid you not, that thing flickered on by itself. That's probably the creepiest thing I saw while there. Story 20. I was raised in a cult, so there wasn't much of a decision on my part to leave, as my parents made that decision when I was about 13. I was never physically abused, but I have a sibling who can barely function as an adult due to these experiences, and I somehow turned out fine. Craziest thing? I saw a 12-year-old girl, fun fact, was sleeping with her 16-year-old neighbor at the time, perform an exorcism on a 60-year-old man in which he began vomiting profusely all over the floor and pretending to speak a dead language. I've got a lot more stories if this gets any attention. The camel's back. Story 21. I was also a member of a discipleship program. It was a 13-month minimum Pentecostal reformative center basically. The program was in the middle of Arkansas. I was one of 35 students there. I was in the women's center. Every morning, we would wake up at 5:30 to pray. We would all go to the basement and sit on our knees facing the backs of chairs and pray out loud for 1 hour every morning. They had leaders walk around the room to make sure everyone was praying. If you didn't pray out loud or fell asleep, you were punished. After that, we ate a communal breakfast, read proverbs, and did chores around the center until 9:30. We then would either go to the shop or down to the classroom. In the classroom, we did Bible study and practical application of biblical principles to our life. The shop was much better. We would make crosses and plaques and other knickknacks which we would sell to fund the ministry. It was a free program, so we would stand outside of Walmarts with our craft tables, taking donations and selling our handmade wares, much like gypsies. After we were done with our daily tasks, we would eat dinner and take showers. Weekday lights out was 10 p.m. Story 22 grew up in the Unification Church, aka the Moonies. My parents joined and I was born into it. Tons of weird stuff happened and still happens there, but hands down the creepiest thing I witnessed is as follows. At one point in the late 90s and early 2000s, the church leadership wanted to collect the blood of the members for some sort of spiritual condition. The church is obsessed with blood lineage for a variety of reasons. I turned up to this blood drive, walked into the room, and there were about 5 huge industrial-sized cooking pots on the tables in the room. They then drew my blood, using sterile equipment thankfully, and immediately emptied the syringe into one of the pots. Then I looked in the pot and realized the pots were full of the co-mingled blood of many different people. I have no idea what happened to the blood afterwards. This is not what made me leave. I was already on my way out at this point. The real nail in the coffin for me was learning of the cult leader's illegitimate children, despite his assertion that relations outside of marriage is the worst sin imaginable. Story 23. My cousin is still involved in Scientology. She lives inside of Sea Org while working for them. She has been a secretary there for over 7 years and is in her early 20s. Her mother cannot talk to her or send letters to her without it being intercepted and discussed on the grounds of how it will affect her focus on the greater good of her being. Once in a while, my aunt will call and get her daughter at the desk and just have enough time to say, "I love you." Now my cousin's father is heavily involved and has been since the earlier days of his establishment. My mom remembers the day he joined California. A car drove up beside him as he was walking down the street and a woman got out and said, "Do you have any real friends? Are you happy with yourself as a person? You seem lonely." She handed him a pamphlet and he went to the church that same day. He was then audited to see what level Thetan he was. Look this crap up, it's crazy. He once told my mom, who had just cut herself while working at a frame shop together, to go back and try to cut herself again. His reasoning? No two same things can happen in this world. He also told my mom that he and other members of the church were going to make this guy's life hell by leaving. They would find out whenever he got a new job and relentlessly call him all day from different numbers. They even went as far as to write complaints. My uncle also has said that having a child is a bad act that oppresses your spirit, and that conceiving is to allow an evil Thetan to trick your good Thetan over into the world we live in now. He explained this is why most adopt Scientology or join after having children, because their Thetan level is so strong it led them to stop their children from doing so. Yet he had kids after converting. It's incredibly sad, and I wish I was making this up. Story 24. My parents thought about being super fundamentalist Christians at one point, so they went to some seminars by Bill Gothard. I think that was his name. Not exactly a cult, but they are super conservative fundamentalists who believe in homeschooling kids and crap. I remember thinking it was really weird because in the kids program, they made people raise their hands a certain way. You had to raise one hand while supporting it with the other hand. So one hand is up vertically and you had to hold the other hand horizontally under it to support it and make an L shape, basically. As a normal kid who went to school with normal people, I thought this looked dumb. That's when I knew something about that place was not right. Story 25. A close family member of mine is a part of a small church, but everyone in the family is positive it's a cult. His wife was diagnosed with breast cancer and did no treatments because the church told her God would cure her. Of course, she got more and more sick and was in a lot of pain. The leaders told her that the devil was inside her and that they needed to pray every day. Eventually it spread and her face and neck swelled up so much you couldn't recognize her. Then the pastor was nutty enough to tell my family member, her husband, that he had a dream that she was going to be cured and get better, that God told him so. 2 days later, she died. My whole family hates this church so much for giving false hope and talking her out of getting any treatments. My close family member is still with his church and has donated thousands to them. It's so sad. Story 26. I am a Southern Baptist, which is by no means a cult, but there are some churches that can definitely do some culty things. Once at Bible camp, they showed us a documentary about how Satan can more easily overtake people who listen to secular music, making them more likely to go to hell. Afterward, there was a giant bonfire, and the kids were encouraged to throw their secular CDs into it. Another time, there was a sick little boy who was getting a heart transplant, so they brought him up to the front of the church. The pastor had olive oil in a fancy little bottle, poured it all over the poor kid's head, while the elders put their hands on him and smeared it on his forehead. And crap, I was 14 or so at the time, remember, with panic thinking, oh geez, is this a cult? Pretty sure this is something a cult would do. Story 27. There is a church in my hometown that is very scary. My mom worked with a member of the church. She came to work one day completely bald. She told my mom that she had decided to divorce her husband and leave the church. Her husband forcibly brought her to the church, and the pastor brought her up in front of everybody and called her a cow, shaved her head, and made her repent. She is still married to the man and attends the church. Also, people who have tried to leave have mysteriously gone missing. Nobody knows if they fled town with none of their belongings, or if they are buried somewhere. I drove past the church on my way to my parents' house. Creeps me out every time. Story 28. This isn't a cult story, but a JW story, since I see there's so many already in this thread. My cousin died of cancer a few months ago, and since his mom's side of the family are Jehovah's Witnesses, that's the kind of funeral they had. The funeral service was heavy on the preaching, which I didn't really like, but it's how they do it, so whatever. But then the priest singled out my cousin's dad, who was not a part of the church, with a big guilt trip in front of everyone, saying he hoped the dad would join the church so that he could see his son again in the afterlife. Using the death of someone's child as a guilt trip to get them to join your church, doing it in front of everyone during a funeral service. Ugh, I hate it so much when my grandmother tells me stories about her church. Women have to be supervised by a man when doing group activities. And although my grandmother is a highly intelligent, educated, and capable person, she doesn't see anything wrong with this. Story 29. I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness from birth. They're a cult in the sneakiest way, because I didn't realize they were a cult until way later, like my late 20s. I always just considered myself a Christian, and I assumed JWs were leaning toward Protestant as opposed to Catholic. Not really the case, but the entire religion really requires you to leave your brain at the door, so it's no wonder I got the wrong idea. I am here to answer any questions anyone might have. La Fiancée consciously began to break away from JW Dom when I was about 11, and I am 31 now, but my entire family, both sides, are still practicing JWs. My parents met through the church, or the Kingdom Hall, as they call it. Story 30. I was in a treatment cult, which was an outpatient treatment center that was run by a mother-daughter therapist team. Once people were better, they would either become a therapist there or find other ways to be given positions of authority. There were 2 women who ran businesses which employed clients. One was landscaping, the other was elderly companion care. Others would house newer members in their homes and would be paid rent by the treatment center. The whole therapy was based off of the 12-step program. Everyone was required to attend the same 6:30 a.m. AA meeting. These meetings were about 95% people from the treatment center, even if alcohol wasn't their drug or addiction of choice. Everyone had to have a sponsor, and they had better be clients of the treatment center so they can better keep tabs on you. You also needed to call your sponsor plus 3 other support people each day to let them know how you're doing. I was never good at expressing my emotions, so these calls, which I rarely made, were basically recaps of what happened to me that day. Newer clients had to attend 3 group therapy sessions each week. These sessions consisted of conflict resolution, that is public shaming. If you weren't following the long, ever-changing list of rules, you were made to feel ashamed in front of about 20 to 30 people. Many times, people were told that they were going to end up back on drugs, or whatever brought them to seek help. Pretty much all clients also attended 1 weekly individual session. Whatever you talked about would then be fair game to be brought up in a group session later. After I left, I read about several complaints made to the state of FL regarding this, as it's a clear violation of HIPAA laws. Story 31, Quick Story XJW, and this happened in my home congregation years ago. A young woman, we'll call her Lizzie, was married. Her husband was not a JW. Lizzie started an affair with an elder. It's still undetermined if the elder began the affair or not, but either way, it happened. Lizzie finally had enough and told the elders about the affair. They all agreed to keep it quiet, but that wasn't what Lizzie wanted to hear. She wanted absolution, so she told her husband. One night, she was at home with a friend of mine. This friend was less than 2 years old. The husband came into the house. Lizzie hid my friend under the bed. The husband shot and ended Lizzie, and may have ended my friend too had he known she was there. It was talked about in our hall, but that was it. It's not what made me leave though. It was the fact that most of the teachings were, well, wrong. I finally realized it recently, and I'm glad I did. Story 32. Accidentally got involved with a cult-like community after I went there for a spiritual retreat, non-denominational, northeastern US within the last few years. After I heard a few rumors, I researched further and discovered the founder, and now deceased spiritual leader, was accused of abuse by numerous female members. These women, who obviously left the group, were harassed by other members for years. That freaked me out. Also, they said they were taking advantage in the same rooms I was currently living in. There are no locks on the doors, and dozens of people who I've just met live there too. The last straw was when one of the guys started harassing me because I didn't want to date him. I told the leaders and promptly left. Last I heard, he was still living there. I think the place has evolved away from its cult-like origins and generally does good things these days. But I won't go back, still a little too cult-like for my taste. Several older women there tried to convince me that the guy I had an issue with was harmless, and it was my fault for removing my affections too quickly. He was being totally inappropriate and harassing me after I clearly asked him to stop. Also lurking outside waiting for me in places where he never went, but knew I went. Super sketch. Story 33. My friend never joined a cult, but they did try to recruit him. My friend had a family friend offer to take him for a free personality test, or some crap like that. So they drive about 30 minutes away. They take him in and give him this test and then tell him they'll call to have him come in for the results. So a few days later, the family friend calls my friend and says they've got the results, so they drive all the way back out there. They sit him down and tell him that he is severely depressed, suicidal, has no idea what he wants to do with his life and on a path to personal destruction, but they can help, and all he has to do is sign up for their courses. Yup, it was Scientology. So my friend tells them to F off, that they have no idea what they're talking about and they're trying to rip him off. This was before Scientology hit the mainstream, so he had no idea that this was a cult. He just assumed they were trying to scam him. Then his family friend tells him that he will join these courses or he can walk home, because he refuses to associate with anyone who would join. So my friend tells him to F off, and he leaves him there, stranded a 30-minute drive from home in a town he doesn't know. He ended up calling his dad to come pick him up, and they never spoke to their family friend again. Story 34. I was raised a Jehovah's Witness, but the part that bothered me the most was when I was reading a court transcript from when my parents went to court to fight about whether I'd receive a blood transfusion when I was born. Here I am, this newborn baby dying in a hospital, and my parents are in court fighting each other about it. My mom said she won, but sometimes I wonder if that's true. Seems unlikely considering how bad off I was that I survived without a transfusion. Father wanted me to get blood. Mom didn't. Mind you, my life continued to be weird until I left at 16. I've been out for 12 years, but I still have moments where I wonder if what I was taught to believe is true. Not because I believe, but because it's hardwired in there. In fact, I wonder if they reason I am so unsuccessful in romantic relationships because of teachings and feeling guilt. Doesn't matter. I am out and it's mostly for the best. Still working through the garbage though. Story 35. I was a teenager sitting in the first hour of what would be a boring and ridiculous 3 hours of church when the male speaker stated, "And if the prophet receives word that we must revisit old doctrine, we must have faith and obey, even if that is the doctrine of polygamy, as this is surely a sign that we must pull together, for the second coming is at hand." I looked around at the congregation in amazement. Not one woman took issue with this. Not one person looked shocked. I stood up, exited the Church of Latter-day Saints, and never returned. This wasn't even in Mormon-saturated Utah or some backwoods town in Idaho. It was in Southern California. Anyone who says that mainstream churches aren't cults needs to revisit the definition of the word.